Well, good evening in Singapore and good morning for everybody in Scotland and the UK. My name is Roddy Gow, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this event at the Asia Scotland Institute, where we will focus today on the important topic of towards a net zero future. I'm delighted to be doing this with our Singapore-based partner, One RHT, and with a very distinguished panel of experts, which I will shortly introduce. As global carbon markets undergo reform, companies pursuing net zero face strategic questions around offset usage, disclosure standards, and innovative mitigation approaches. Our expert speakers will discuss the latest policy developments and science-based decarbonisation fundamentals. Our panel, featuring sustainability leaders from the UK and Asia, will compare regional trends, analysing how jurisdictions like the EU taxonomy for sustainable activities are influencing Asia. They'll spotlight best practices in emissions reporting and examine whether carbon markets transitioning from voluntary to compliance regimes will limit reliance on credits. So turning to our panel. RB Jacob is the director of RHT Green, an ESG sustainability consultancy of One RHT. He's had 30 years of work experience, having started his own company and having held senior leadership positions in multinationals across Asia, the Pacific, and the United States. He's a highly experienced and accomplished business leader with a proven track record of success in driving operational excellence, sustainability, and people development. He has over 20 years of experience in senior roles at multinational companies including Ecolab, Cadbury Schweppes, and Nortel Networks. And prior to that, he was General Manager Singapore and concurrently the Human Resources Director, Southeast Asia and India at Ecolab. In this role, he was responsible for the company's overall business performance in Singapore, as well as the HR function across Southeast Asia and India. Bill Ireland is the Chief Executive Officer of Logan Energy, based here in Scotland. And he has over 30 years experience in engineering with specialist knowledge in integrated energy systems, energy within the built environment, alternative technologies, sustainable design, and innovation in technology. Before joining Logan in his senior roles in the building services industry, Bill believed that hydrogen and fuel cell technologies would form a major part of the future of our energy provision, and made the decision to join Logan in 2008 as operations director. In 2012, Bill became MD and CEO and has made Logan Energy the designers, integrators, installers and maintainers of the majority of the UK's installed capacity of fuel cell distributed generation, and developed the business into a world-leading provider of integrated hydrogen-based solutions for storage. Finally, Thomas McMahon is the co-CEO and co-founder of ACX, AirCarbon Exchange. It's a proprietary regulated environmental asset trading platform that is revolutionizing the environmental markets. Tom is an exchange architect with over 35 years experience building commodities exchanges under US and Asian exchange and regulatory frameworks, with a focus on the development of exchange-traded cleared futures and OTC products. His experience includes building and running NYMEX Asia, the Hong Kong Mercantile Exchange, DME, and SMX ICE Singapore. So that's our distinguished panel. And before handing over, I would just say that our format is that the panel will discuss the issues raised, beginning with opening remarks by Tom McMahon. And after his talk and panel comments from the others, we'll open for Q&A from our audience. Everything's being recorded and subsequently made available on YouTube, and you can pose questions by using the Q&A or chat facilities. So with great thanks to everybody listening, Tom, over to you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to present, and here we go. So I'm going to give just a short presentation, short slides, and really, this is really just to give a baseline of where the voluntary markets are currently, how they've evolved, how they interact with the compliance markets, and where we're talking about, as you had mentioned previously, the potential of a convergence, really, where compliance and voluntary are going to meet. So. Yep, let's move along. So if you look at really the three pieces of the voluntary markets as we know them today, the compliance market, the pure voluntary or VCM market as we know it, and the Art 6 market, which is really where the two sort of blend and come together, and probably where the biggest challenges that we are facing today, post COP28, in how Article 6 forms up. The compliance market is a legacy that's been with us from the beginning, really. If you look at carbon as we know it today, it's really a 2-decade legacy, going back to 2003 and then 2005, the beginning of the Kyoto protocols and the European markets. As we've noted here, I mean, as examples, the EU emissions trading scheme, which is the most active carbon market as we know it today, and Korea ETS. But there are others that have stayed in it over the decades, the California markets, the Quebec, Australia, New Zealand, and such. So in the compliance, and we have newer compliance markets that are coming on, and we'll talk about an example of that in terms of Singapore later on. The VCM, as we know it, is really dependent on a willingness to mitigate. The first go rounds, as we knew it under the Kyoto and UN protocols, basically 2003-5 till 2012, the market was very successful. And probably one of the most interesting parts was that you had a window open between the compliance market and the voluntary market, that a percentage of the good delivery into the European market allowed for a real scaling of the CDM voluntary market as we knew it. And then that window closed in 2012 for a number of different reasons. But fundamentally, the market, where today we've got 193 signatory countries under the Paris Accords, at that time there were only 47 countries. So you had a lot of gaps, and it allowed for the market to be ultimately abused in that too many credits were created and there were not enough consumers really to mitigate or balance off that. So the market was shifted away back to a pure compliance market as we know it under the allowance markets. The Article 6 market is really an evolution of the Paris Accords as we know it, and it's still formative, but it takes the state or country level obligations very seriously under the Article 6.2. And Article 6.4 is a window that allows for the voluntary market, or really for the incubation of methodologies that allow for carbon mitigation, whether it's removals or avoidance type methodologies. But it's still a market to be formed up, and there's still a lot of challenges and still a lot of explanations to be made relative to how it gets adopted and how it gets utilized. Okay, go ahead. So probably the market we need to focus on the most today is really the compliance carbon market, in that you look at the EU market today as we know it, it's the largest of the markets, and it's not a voluntary market, we know. And it's really the cost of, or the permission to emit a ton of carbon. And that's the price as we know it today. And it's had a very large variation all the way from €6 a ton to €100 a ton and back down. But the market trades actively and it's well followed, and it's a compliance market. The markets that we look at in terms of the voluntary market may have an opportunity to become part of that market again. There's been some new language around the voluntary, I should say, there's new language around the removals market, around removal specifications, removals technology. And now the European market is looking to address the opportunity to support removals in terms of the technology, and also potentially that they could be accepted as the mitigants. So you could have a reopening of that window, but very specifically around removals. And so it's a significant shift, and it has a relevance to, we need to get a price for carbon. We have a price for a compliance market. It's a very clear price, but we don't have a price for the voluntary market. We had some pricing. If you look back to 2020 and 21, we had a market, and we were part of that formation, along with other groups, the expansive CBL groups, ICE and such. And you had a lot of players that pushed into the market. We were trying to create a standardized product that would represent certain parts, like CORSIA compliance and nature-based compliance. And the uptake was quite significant. And then we hit the bumps in the road, and a lot of bumps. And that's very common in new market formation. It's not anything out of the ordinary. But carbon, I think, has suffered quite a bit of reputational damage, unfortunately. But what's emerging out of it is best practices. And we're starting to see a shift that will allow for compliance markets and voluntary methodologies to converge, where you've got high standards of quality, verifiability, and integrity. And I think that's really going to be the key that's going to allow for the shift to back to a more standardized, what I call a good delivery mechanism around specific project or methodology types in the market. So next. As I spoke about the voluntary market, and keep going, let's go. I think the key, really the next steps for the countries is really this, the CDM and the evolution into the Article 6. And this is the UN protocol uptakes. I can tell you that Article 6, there's a lot of experts in the world, and I'm not quite sure that any one person knows everything about Article 6. It's quite a challenge, but the basis of it makes good sense. So if you look at 6.2, this is country level responsibilities, the NDC reporting the obligation to mitigate at country level the carbon footprints of countries. And how they do that is the mechanism of 6.2, how one country can swap with another country and officially record the offsetting processes. The 6.4 allows for countries to actually create a revenue stream based on their carbon mitigation and supporting different methodologies. And so blending of the two is very interesting from an economic standpoint, but clearly from an environmental standpoint. But there are still a lot of challenges in the interpretations. And hopefully over the next year to 2 years, we'll have that sorted out and have a much more clearer definition of how we can best utilize this to support the market going forward at both domestic and state levels, as well as international trading, of which we're a part of. So next. This is really just a baseline of what carbon, right? We've got carbon markets. We're looking for a pricing regime. We have carbon markets that allow for credits to be bought and sold. And this is unique, the transference and the evolution of a market for a primary market and a secondary market to evolve. The standardization of 1 ton of representing 1 ton of CO2, whether it's mitigating, avoiding, or removing, is really key. So the standardization is there and the recognition of it. And as we've noted, the compliance market and the voluntary market. And then what we're going to see going forward is, 1 second, please, is really the ART6 market. And that's really the convergence market where we converge compliance and voluntary. Okay, next. This is an example of a new compliance market emerging. This is the example of the Singapore market and how a country has recognized that under their obligation to Paris, each of the 193 signatory states had the opportunity to choose what kind of an emissions trading system or scheme that they wanted to take up. And Singapore has taken up basically a tax scheme with a small window that allows for a 5% of the underlying requirements to be utilized by investing in international high quality voluntary credits. Now it's interesting. It's not a huge number relative to the 5%, but it's an interesting opportunity for investment in going ex-Singapore to invest in these projects, support it, and then bring that back to Singapore. And it'll become a more significant part because if we go to the next slide, it's a scaling cost. As we are today in the pilot phase, 2019 to 23, it was $5 a ton. We're at $25 a ton, going to 45. And by 2030, 50 to 80. And I think we will probably be towards the higher end of that. And part of that responsibility is really a reflection of CBAM, the EU cross-border adjustment mechanism. And if you look at it as a trend based on the last 2 years of EUA prices, it will be at the higher end of that spectrum, euros versus dollars. And it's an interesting point because I think Singapore itself, 32% of trade is EU based. So it will have a significant impact on not just the cost of carbon, but also on international trade through their port facilities. So looking from that, you can get to what's called equivalence. And this is an interesting opportunity for the price of carbon globally relative to the EU. Equivalence will allow for the host countries or the exporting country to balance against the European pricing. So I believe that you will start to see investment, and probably mostly in removal specifications. And I think there's a slide that really looks at the pricing. We can skip ahead. There we go. Let's start there. And this is really a pricing trend that we're starting to see. And if you look at that top line, the removals top line, where you're getting a true tracking of the investment in removal specifications. And that goes all the way from biochar, nature-based removals of CO2, all the way to direct air capture, the exotic end of the climate works. And we're seeing literally pulling CO2 out of the air up in Iceland in the basis. And you're going from basically $45 a ton at the low end of biochar to $1,200 a ton at the high end of DACs. And in the middle of it is the technologies of CCS and CCUS. And we're now starting to see a cross-border, like here in the case of Singapore to Indonesia, as the countries are now starting to work together, looking at setting up removal specifications within the CCS, carbon capture and storage, and utilization of depleted oil wells. The legacy of the oil industry in Southeast Asia can now be turned into a storage facility for CO2 in the future. That will have a high pricing point, which will allow for equivalence up against the European price. So it's a very interesting metric that's going to drive equivalence across the carbon space and carbon pricing methodologies. So next. I think I've touched on all of these, and these are different type of credits, right? Avoidance, removals, cook stoves, which are basically home appliance credits, which are very popular in rural nations and have been over the past 20 years. Biodiversity is a newer part of what over the last year and a half, been a lot of conversations around the attributes of biodiversity credits, but it's still very cloudy relative to what defines it. And then we have the general VCM credits, which, as I noted before, we've had some problems with them. But I think, like anything else, if you look at the commodities world, generally, as a new asset class emerges, it always has early on, it suffers pain and pangs, but the market starts to become very efficient very quickly. And we're in that process now on generally around across the VCM sector. Next. This is ACX. I don't need to do a song and dance, but we are generally addressing the world. We began here in Singapore 5 years ago. We've grown. We said we're across 33 different countries, and we have cross-exchange partnerships in Athens and Brazil and Germany and US, multiple offices, and our key target markets. We can, as you can see. But the interesting thing about carbon is regionalized, but it's also an international commodity, and it crosses borders. As we know, the environmental impact is borderless, and it has to be addressed as such. And we're doing that from a financial standpoint and an infrastructure standpoint for trade. All right.
Tom, that's great. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Interesting, for getting us going too. So I think now, Arby, I'm handing over to you to say a few words, and then we'll move across to Bill.
Yeah, so my role here was to ask some questions, right, regarding this topic. So I'm just going to fire away some questions so that the audience kind of gets some perspective on what's been said. So Thomas, thank you for that. And I'd like to ask you to continue around this because, when we talk about the decarbonization process or the strategy, right, sometimes we tend to get a little lost in where the carbon credits, the markets and all that fit in. So if you could just give a very broad overview about how carbon credit actually comes into the decarbonization strategy for a company or even for an industry, that would be great.
Yeah, I think probably the most important things to realize is that if I do my job correctly, we will not be trading carbon credits in 10 or 15 years. It's a transition. It's a transitory investment. The key is to change our habits, right? So that people talk about the energy transition and such. The reality is it's a good investment today, but it should not be a permanent. It's not a permanent solution. but there is a real cost and a real price. So the key is to get a price correctly and to have the market integrity and verifiability and quality. So you've got market integrity in this transitory phase going forward. It's really an assisting process as opposed to a permanent fix. Yeah.
Right, thanks. I'm also going to ask this question around the word that is bandied around, which is the quality of carbon credits, right? So, for example, if you look at a country like Indonesia, they've put their intent out that they want to be the world's biggest carbon credit trading country in the world. And sometimes people talk about saying, oh, but the quality of carbon credits, and what does that really mean?
I mean, from our perspective, when we began this, we looked at a couple of problems that we knew were inherent in the carbon market. One of them was friction, opacity, and quality and verifiability, right? And the dependence is on third-party verifiers. And if you look at any industry today, we accept standards of inspection. I mean, probably the simplest one is a gold bar. I mean, if you look at gold in the world today, the standard, the high bar, not trying to be funny, but the highest standard is LBMA, right? And if an LBMA, London Bullion Market Association, looks and verifies your refinery as an LBMA good delivery, it is accepted, right? That is your standard. If you go out to Jurong Island here in Singapore, and there's an oil tank out there, and a company like SGS goes in and does what's called a dip in your tank, and they test the oil that's in that tank and comes back with a report, it's accepted as a standard. Carbon has not achieved that standard yet. There are people in the industry. There are people entering the industry. We brought in a couple of different players. We brought BSI, British Standards Institute, into the carbon business. They had never been there before because we wanted a third party, a neutral set of eyes to do some verifications for us. So it's still evolving, but that market integrity question has been across pretty much anything that's commoditized today, whether it's the construction and shipping industry, mining industry, agro industry. The standards are there. Carbon's in that transitory state right now to accept standards.
There's a question come in from a member of the audience, which is, what are some key trends that we will be seeing in sustainability reporting? Is there a case for including scope 4 emission anytime soon?
Scope 4, boy, that's a new one to me.
Scope 4 emission. Yes.
I do the scope 1, 2, 3 dance. I didn't know there was a scope 4. I'm not being funny. Really, scope 3 is a challenge.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think scope 4 is, like really new. People are talking about it, and there's a kind of a offset or offshoot from scope 3. But as Tom rightfully pointed out, doing scope 3 is difficult enough, even from a consulting perspective, right?
Yeah.
It's really our scope 3 might be someone else's scope 1, and so how do you delineate all of that?
Yeah.
So
yeah. I mean, even the SEC was very forward thinking in including scope 3 reporting, for all SEC listed companies, and now they've even backed off of that scope 3 because they realize what you just said, Abe. What's a scope 3 to 1 is a scope 1 to somebody else. So you're going to get captured in the reporting. Does it have to be a duality, or is it? So yeah, it's quite a challenge. I'll have to look up scope 4. Do some homework after this.
Do you see, for example, when we talk about independent verifiers, right? Like certain countries, they have their own verification bodies. Do you see a time that's coming up soon, maybe in a year, 3 years, 5 years, where the standards, the international standards like Vera and GS and all that, and the various country certifications are going to merge or converge to a similar standard?
I don't think it'll happen. It's very funny. If you go from like 2003 to 2019, and Vera and Gold Standard, I mean, first of all, they're NGOs, right? They're not for profits, and they grew out of the United Nations inability to keep up with the demand of becoming, the keeper of the flame, fundamentally, right? They're the librarian of the methodologies. It's a bit of a thankless task. I know there are other people that have tried to turn it into a for-profit mechanism, but that becomes very convoluted and conflicted also. So I don't think we need fragmentation, right? Even though we do have dominant countries, there's no doubt that like DRC, Indonesia, and Brazil will constitute a majority of the potential creditization. But there has to be a neutral third. There has to be a party over and above that. I don't know that it's Vera or gold standard going forward, but I believe it's got to stay significantly independent.
Yep.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
Let me just change tack for a while and ask Bill. I know Bill's going to present a little later, but I just want to move into this technology realm and move a little bit away from carbon credits. Bill, you'd like to tell the audience a little bit about energy transitions and how that comes into play in the decarbonization process?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a few slides to run through which might explain it, but it's we've looked at the value of carbon credits over the last 10-15 years, and to be honest, they haven't had an impact at all on decision making because of the low value of carbon. That's now transitioning. And as we've seen, will transition quite quickly, so that will give additional incentive to transitioning to reduce carbon. What we're doing is very much approaching it from a meeting ESG requirements for individual companies, but also for cost certainty and cost savings. So, I mean, if we're producing renewable electricity and it needs storing, then there are a number of ways of doing it. Batteries have been the initial way. That's why batteries have kicked off. We're still putting batteries in as energy storage into grid systems, but actually for any large amount or large amount or long duration storage, hydrogen, which is where we come in, is one of the key vectors basically. Now that everybody's talking about green methanol, green ammonia, liquid hydrogen, green liquid hydrogen, or green compressed hydrogen. All of that has to come so the ammonia and methanol has to come from green hydrogen, which has to come from renewable electricity generation or biofuels to generate the hydrogen, to generate the methanol and the ammonia. So we've then also got the blue side of it, which is sort of carbon capture and storage. Again, that's, I think, a transition. But it's a big focus at the moment, and that's partly what concerns me about the carbon offsetting or avoidance of carbon emissions, is that it'll be dominated by the oil and gas industry, and that will actually drive the cost down. So alternative technologies and energy supply will be suppressed by that, and there should potentially be a multiplier factor between the source of carbon or the type of carbon reduction. I'm not sure if there is or isn't at the moment. So from our point of view, we're looking at it from a commercial point of view. We are looking at where customers are obliged to reduce carbon emissions, and most of this either comes from internal requirements or from regulation. So we have, for example, we installed fuel cells in the middle of London in the Walkie-Talkie building, 20 Fenchurch Street, running off fossil fuels, but we were saving carbon because the planning requirements required you to reduce your carbon emissions compared to the building regulations in the middle of London, because London was striving to be ahead of other cities in carbon reduction. Putting a fuel cell in there, stationary fuel cell, was the most cost-effective solution for them to hit their carbon reduction objectives. So we focus on those sort of elements where it makes sense. In Singapore, and in fact, I'm coming out to Singapore on for the Clean Maritime Week of the 15th of April. So anybody on the call, it'd be great to meet you guys when I'm out. But we're coming out for that. That is very much around looking at Singapore. port authorities have said, right, okay, by 2030, everything needs to be electric or biofuel vessels. Well, electric is fine, battery electric is fine, but it's short duration. If you're actually doing anything with large amounts of energy, you need something as an alternative. So you need an alternative zero carbon fuel. All of those are legislation driven, not commercial driven. The commercial side encourages it. So the carbon trading will play a bigger effect now, or carbon offsetting, because you can then say, okay, right, well, we can apply for those credits, and that helps the transition, because things have to change, and change costs. Unless you're just replacing an old piece of equipment, and boats, tugs, whatever, last for decades. Buses 20 years, trains 30, 40 years. 2050 is 26 years away. We don't have a lot of time to actually hit this. So we've actually got to invest into the energy transition. And part of the way is by encouraging this is by the carbon trading scheme. I've probably spoken through most of my slides, but
No, that is great. Before I hand it back to you, Bill, I'm just going to ask, I mean, this being a forum of the Asia Scotland Institute, what are some of the learnings we can take away, I mean, between the two continents, right? I mean, EU is kind of far ahead of the game, and Singapore is kind of a little ahead.
I think it's a good question, and I've been asked this at a number of talks around the world. And my first one is don't do demonstration projects again. If you're going to do a demonstration project, do a new one. But if it's been done elsewhere, learn from those and actually use that in a commercial application and start making what we're doing commercially viable. Because a lot of the projects that have gone ahead have been grant funded, partially by European Union or UK government, or Scottish government. And so sort of that's where we come in. That's why we're coming on this innovation program to Singapore, is to bring what we've done and to work with partners in Singapore and the region to actually bring that knowledge. And we've basically been doing this since 1995 in various forms, whether it's with green hydrogen or fossil fuels or whatever, but actually more efficient applications.
Could you give us,
so
just very quickly, could you give us an example of what a demonstration project is? I mean, like where it's being done now and why it's...
Well, one of the ones we're doing is zero carbon whiskey, gin and vodka in a distillery, typically Scottish. It's the distillery. They are usually relatively remote. They're usually running off something like fuel oil for their heating. They are usually in a rural setting, so they have land around, so they can potentially use wind and solar. Solar even in Scotland, and so basically we are using the hydrogen as an energy storage vector, and that's going directly. So we have wind and solar producing renewable electricity into an electrode boiler to produce steam for the distilling process. Excess electricity produces hydrogen. That hydrogen we're actually using for transport, but primarily to go into a hydrogen steam boiler to generate the steam when the wind isn't blowing and the sun's not shining. So again, using that as a storage mechanism. So this is sort of a self-sufficient micro system. They actually grow their own crops on the land. They grow peas for the gin. Peas put carbon back into the soil, so actually it's carbon positive. It's a carbon positive gin, so it's a very good excuse to drink more. But but that's an example. We're doing shipping, so we're doing inland waterways, so barges using byproduct hydrogen from the chloralkali process, which is using renewable electricity for the electrolysis of brine, so a sodium chloride solution. You produce chlorine and hydrogen. The hydrogen is then going into the barge that then ships the salt from one location in North Netherlands to Rotterdam, and back, and then bring cargo back again. So byproduct hydrogen is being used as a transport fuel to actually transport the raw material for the chloralkali industry. So again, it's joining all these loops together and sort of making a whole system of it.
All right, so let me just now hand it back to you, Bill, for the rest of your slides, and then we'll open it up for questioning for the audience.
Okay, I've only got a few, so it shouldn't take too long. So I'll just share those, hopefully. So hopefully you can see that. Does that come up?
Yes, it has.
Excellent, jolly good. My background is very much around reducing energy consumption in buildings. For 20 years, I was a mechanical electrical consultant, designing buildings, trying to reduce the amount of energy they were using. So using more daylight, using more natural cooling, insulating buildings better, keeping them airtight so that you could actually control where the losses were, that sort of thing. Decided then actually, well, why stop at the building line? Look at the infrastructure, the primary energy source. So looked at sort of combined cooling, heat and power schemes. And again, that's how I got into fuel cells. So I've taken that into looking at whole systems. Because if you look at individual systems at a time, there are massive opportunities, and actually it drives you in the wrong direction quite often to actually increase emissions. And you can see that in something like in Denmark, where they were actually deploying large quantities of wind turbines. They were exporting it to Germany, and then Germany decided, actually, we're going to do this ourselves. What actually happened was Denmark's carbon emissions for its grid actually rose because they had a large proportion of electricity generated from wind turbines, but they had to have a large number of power stations sitting in hot standby, waiting for the wind to drop off, so they still had electricity. So they were actually sitting there using fossil fuels, emitting CO2, but not actually using the electricity. So you have all these unforeseen consequences. So if you look at the thing as a whole system, then that's the way we approach it, and we look at it from as I said, a commercial point of view as well. So sorry, let's get the next slide. So, for example, the distillery, we're looking at the uses for hydrogen or a hydrogen-based fuel. And to be honest, fossil fuels, and I say this with tongue in cheek, but fossil fuels are a renewable energy. The problem is the timescale. It's hundreds of millions of years, because actually fossil fuels have come from flora and fauna that have been decomposed into hydrocarbons, and it's just another fuel. What we're doing here is then looking at short-term generation and storage, depending on where you are. Looking at biofuels, if you're looking at short rotation coppice willow, that's a 3-year cycle to actually grow the willow and then put the biochips into a boiler to provide heat or electricity. So what we're doing here is we're looking on the left-hand side is what is our primary source. Over here, wind, solar, grid. So again, integrating it with the grid so that we have we can help balance the grid, so we can generate hydrogen when we've got excess grid. So EDF in France, they produce 86% of electricity to the French nation. Nuclear power. Zero carbon or at least zero carbon anyway, but it's a flat load, it's a base load, but the load profile is not flat, so they need to use the electricity. So actually they can produce hydrogen when the demand for electricity is lower, and you can then store that and then either regenerate electricity or use it as a transport fuel or whatever. So on the right hand side, and this is where we sort of come from, is no one really wants hydrogen. What they want is to move their lorry down the road, drive their bus, their train, move their ship along, heat their building. There's some hydrogen used as a feedstock. They want heat, or they want electricity. And hydrogen is just a mechanism of doing that. And so we look at all of that and the different sources, whether it's steam reformation of fossil fuel or biogas. We look at energy. We do all of these elements basically that are dark here ourselves. So we do smart grid management. We integrate electrolyzers, compression, storage, dispensing to vehicles, but then also into other aspects. And one of the key elements here is not buying individual components and someone saying, okay, I'll have this size of electrolyzer and this technology and this, and then I'm going to do this with it. It's actually looking at the whole system, because you can save in your capital cost and your operating costs by looking at the whole thing. And with this sort of approach, I can guarantee the costs for a bus operator for the next 20 years. I can say, to drive your bus down the road in 20 years' time, I can give you a price now, because I have the renewable energy input. I have the hydrogen storage, I can put it into vehicles, and I have vehicles that perform. So therefore, that's a capital outlay with a little bit of operating costs and some plant replacement, but minor over the 20 years. And I can basically say, there you go. You can't do that with other fuels at the moment. So that's, for example, that's the commercial approach we take to this. Adding in carbon trading, even better, gives us more security. In the financial side. We don't just draw pictures of it. This is something we did in Scotland between 2014 and 16. This is a microgrid with a wind turbine, a small energy center here, 7 buildings on private wires, photovoltaics over here and on this roof here. And that basically could produce up to 910 kilowatts of output at peak load. The site only needed about 150 peak load, so we deployed hydrogen storage for both transport and for energy storage that went into a boiler as the primary boiler, and also generate electricity when there was insufficient electricity from the renewables. That's delivered. That's what we do. So we actually deliver stuff, and that's why people come to us. Just a quick selection of some of the people. Everybody from the late Queen having a fuel cell at the garden party at Buckingham Palace, to provide power to the tents, marquees, and all the way through to national bodies. So the National Physical Laboratory, we've provided equipment for and worked with. Comes back to your point about having notified bodies that will certify it. And I was going to mention earlier, you have the Wood Stewardship Council which has been developed for sustainable timber. That's been developed, and that's a standard. So it comes back to having standardization bodies and certification bodies to actually certify your carbon credits and that sort of thing. And we've been working with some of them on that. And so what we've done over the years is basically come to a conclusion that we need to standardize. We're doing hydrogen refueling stations. This is the largest in the world in Northern Ireland. In fact, I was there yesterday. Hydrogen production. This is a 5 megawatt solar plant with a megawatt electrolyzer, and then trailer filling unit here to fill trailers with hydrogen, to deploy it to bus depots and that sort of thing. And then this over here on the top right is Lloyd's approved. In fact, I think it's on the next slide actually. This is the barge in the Netherlands. So this is ADR, which is dangerous goods on roads, and Lloyd's registry approved for going on the shipping for inland waterways. So this is what we are doing here. So all of these are possible, and hydrogen is so flexible to offset your carbon that it's got multiple sources or not multiple uses. This is another project where we're converting this survey ship, which is a high value ship because it's got a lot of survey equipment in it, and replacing the diesel power to be hydrogen power. And this again has to go through sort of certification and approval. Some modifications to the propeller as well to improve the efficiency as well. So it's not just looking at sort of the powertrain, it's looking at the overall system as a whole, reducing drag, increasing propeller efficiency, and then you still need power. How do you deliver that in a zero carbon way? And that's pretty much what we're about, is collaboration in the regions. That's why we're coming to Singapore to do deployment as well, and for new applications. And this is sort of what we offer here is sort of we're technology agnostic, and that helps us be independent. So we're a hybrid between a specialist consultant and a delivery company, and we do the operating and maintenance as well, which feeds back into our designs. So it's a nice circle of actually improving everything.
Well, Bill,
So anyway, I'm over in 3 weeks, so I would love to have a chat with anybody that's interested on the call.
Sure. For the layman, right? And many of us are lay people when it comes to all of this technology and all that. We've been hearing for a long time that hydrogen is the answer, if I may put it in that manner. Maritime capabilities, land capabilities, air capabilities. In an ideal world, when do you think we will achieve nirvana with hydrogen?
It's one of the things. I've got another slide that has some top tips, and the last point is hydrogen is not the answer. It's part of it, and it's working out where it fits best, because you don't put a hydrogen fuel cell system in your mobile phone. A battery is perfect for that. If you need longer duration, you can buy a little battery pack to then charge your phone with. Economically, that's the best thing to do. Logically, engineering wise, completely the right thing to do. It's where it steps in, and I think the general consensus is long duration, large users, and that can be anything. Long duration can be 3 hours, and large usage, or it doesn't need to be long distance. It can be mining trucks that are doing a mile backwards and forwards, but use a lot of energy. They're electric vehicles anyway. They've just got a diesel electric engine, 4 megawatt diesel electric engine in them. So a lot of this is just applying the same engineering principles and solutions to different applications. We're also doing water treatment works and also aquaculture, where they want the oxygen, because they want the oxygen to actually improve the water treatment works. They want the oxygen for the fish, and the hydrogen is the byproduct. So the hydrogen can then be used for powering generators or vehicles or service vehicles to the water treatment plants, all those sort of things. So it's, again, looking at it holistically. So when is hydrogen? Hydrogen is now. I mean, for those that need it, it's actually a cheaper way of doing things in some areas, and that will increase as policy changes, as the carbon price changes, and we drive further forward on the I suppose self-sufficiency and away from fossil fuels and carbon emissions.
Thank you, Bill, for that. Roddy, with your permission now, maybe we should open this up for questions from the audience that we have today.
Yes, that's a good idea. We only have had the one so far, but there may be more. So if people want to use the chat or the Q&A function, please do so. While we're waiting, Bill, can I ask you what the developments in Russia, which are all pretty unpleasant, of course, what's going on in terms of carbon-related activities?
In Russia, I think, well, I mean, their economy is driven by oil and gas, so I'm not sure they're particularly interested in that at the moment. I'm not sure. We're not really dealing with Russia and haven't ever. But we do have a joint venture in China. China is quite an interesting one because they're just plowing ahead with it. They see the requirements, the opportunities. They have vast areas that can be lent out to PV, solar electricity production and wind production, and they are putting up gigawatts. And their proposal is producing hydrogen. I think they have the largest array of electrolyzers in the world, which is not that big. It's only 250 megawatts. But that is a factor of 10 bigger than any other cluster of electrolyzers in the rest of the world. So they're taking it very seriously. They're a big, using probably a wrong analogy, but a big oil tanker, and they take a lot to turn around, but they move very quickly. And we see China as an opportunity, not only for us helping them in deploying that, but also China helping the rest of the world in delivery of supply chain equipment. And we have to. Europe can't do it on its own. The rest of the world can't do it on its own. And what we need to do is work together to do this. It's politics gets in the way, and human rights and all those sort of things. But really, we have to get over that and be a bit magnanimous about it and sort of do what we can do, engage with it. But at the end of the day, we won't be arguing about that if the sea levels have risen to 2 meters and whatever. We'll be arguing about different things.
Thanks.
Okay, we have some questions coming up from John Lukit. A question for Tom: is Thailand on your radar for collaboration or projects? If not, why not?
The answer is yes. Thailand is on our radar, and it needs to be paid attention to, most definitely. I think the challenge is Thailand, very interestingly, prior to the modern time of the Paris Accords, they were very active carbon project development within the country. Companies like South Pole had gone in there years ago, back in 2014-15, and had helped incubate a lot of projects around agriculture. Subsequent to that, the country is now paying attention to it, like all the other countries are in the region. Thailand is challenged in that it's got a Ministry of the Environment, it's got a banking system, it's got a very sophisticated stock exchange, it's got private enterprise. I will tell you, it's not unified in any way, shape, or form, but there's a willingness in Thailand really to start to pay attention to environmental compliance. Bangkok as a city is very environmentally challenged, and they know it. And so we actually have a lot of very interesting, active conversations with Thailand. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Another question from Bruno Kralstein. For Bill, are we stuck with ammonia in the future when we look at hydrogen industrial implementation, especially maritime?
It's an interesting one. There are big debates going on about the whole thing, and everybody pushing particular elements of it. We're keeping our eye on everything because we're, again, as I said, we're technology agnostic. If you want green ammonia, you've got to have green hydrogen. You've got to produce it somehow or another. Green ammonia is the best way of shipping energy around, but not necessarily using it on a ship. My concern, and I think this is, I don't know how this gets dealt with, is ammonia we ship around already, but we don't use it in the engine room. If you have a leak of ammonia in an engine room, it kills people.
Yeah.
If you have a leak of diesel or methanol or hydrogen, it doesn't. It can do if not dealt with properly, but ammonia, I think, has that challenge for actually being a fuel for shipping. I think it's much more likely to be methanol, green methanol, for large distance shipping. We're working with the Yangtze River Authority because they have a project which they initially started calling the electrification of the Yangtze, and they're now calling it decarbonising the Yangtze because they realise that electrifying it is not the best way of doing it. If you're doing that on the Yangtze, you're no more than sort of 200 meters away from the shore. So you don't actually need a large amount of fuel on board, because actually when you're stopping at a port, you can actually quite easily refuel. And with hydrogen, you can refuel in 15 minutes while you're offloading something. That's not an issue. So having compressed hydrogen there is, I think, the right solution. They might go for methanol. If you're doing open water shipping, that's another one. I think that might be that will definitely be methanol. It won't be compressed hydrogen. And ammonia, I think, is probably reserved for transferring large amounts of energy long distances, but not necessarily for direct use in maritime. I know a lot of people are looking at it and saying this is the solution, but I think there are high risks associated with it that people aren't necessarily addressing at the moment.
Right. Thanks, Bill. Question from Flora. Will green tariffs be a better strategy long term? Just open it to any member of the panel.
I think it's great to collect the money, but what do you do with it? I mean, if it's a straight tax and it's not redeployed, you're creating a linear system that's just a real cost that's just going to continually be passed through. I don't think it changes behaviors. It's got to have a circularity to it. It's a redeployment of what's captured. So I think that's the challenge right now. The taxes, I don't think anybody likes taxes. But we do know, I can tell you that the word voluntary is probably the worst thing in voluntary carbon credits, is that there's no company in the world or any individual in the world that, well, do you really want to spend more money, but you don't have to? The answer is no.
Yeah.
So the reality is, so if you're going to collect it, you have to redeploy it. I think that's really the challenge.
Yeah, I think on that, I think it's actually tax credits, which a number of countries are deploying. So you're actually paying less tax. Taxes may rise generally, but if you don't actually do something, you'll be penalised from just paying normal tax. So it's giving tax credits, which is actually making your products in effect cheaper than your competitor. So therefore that will drive, and sort of the chief execs of the businesses and the shareholders will be saying, why are we paying this much tax? As a business, we should be reducing our tax burden. And I think that is sort of, at the end of the day, large corporations, their shareholders will be sort of calling the tunes, and that's where it'll be coming from. So I think I think it's the reverse of that, and I think the carrot is better than the stick in this application.
Just 2 more questions. What are the top 3 things that Singapore-based companies must get right between now and 2025 to achieve their sustainability goals?
Cool.
Yeah, what do they need to get right? I think first the recognition is that what's actually got the biggest carbon footprint in Singapore, and I think that's really the denial. Everybody'd like to say it's airplanes and ships and cars, and it's not. It's buildings. It's the immovable objects that actually have the largest carbon footprint here. So I think the construction industry, the development industry, the finance industry have really got to take a better accounting of their responsibilities. That's been a tough question here, and it's interesting. So I think that's one recognition that's got to change quite dramatically. I think if you look at the general sense is that Asia and Southeast Asia is actually lagging behind in its responsibility of decarbonization or environmental awareness. And I think that's got to change significantly. And I think it'll probably change. There'll be a pain point. Basically, the ability to borrow and lend the cost of money is going to go up if you don't start to adhere to some of the demand shifts. So I think that's really some of the points that I've seen.
Well, I can contribute a couple of items here. I think, for Singapore-based companies, the mindset is that, all right, as long as we do a sustainability report on an annual basis, things are going to be great. But I think it goes far beyond that, right? We also have to work on SMEs who think that, well, if I have a government grant, then I'll try and do something about it, right? But soon I cannot keep focused on that. And the last thing is really training and building a culture, right, of decarbonization. And I mean that decarbonization has to be part of the business strategy, not something separate. So because you can, people who collect data, you ask them, what are you collecting this for? Says my boss wants it. You ask the boss and he says, no, my boss wants it. So, right, that element of education and why we are doing certain things around decarbonization is completely lacking. So these are some of the things that I think.
It's very interesting. We had a similar conversation in a roundtable discussion, and one of the aspects is where does ESG sit in your business, as far as who is responsible? Is it just tacked on to somebody else's job function, or is it actually does it sit at the board with somebody with the same responsibility? As everybody else, whether it's production or legal or whatever, or human resource. It's got to be in every part of the business. It's got to be in everybody's mindset, and it is a mindset change. And to a degree, I think it's an educational thing and a generational thing, and it will change. Saying what to do in 24, 25, that's a bit late. Should have been doing it 10 years ago. So we actually need to have a long-term strategy and bring that into your business and have it as a core part of it.
It's got to go from the marketing team to the compliance and treasury team. That's the reality, and unfortunately, it's very often still on the marketing side of the business, which is great. It's the warm and the fluffy, but the reality is,
which is to a degree why we focus on the commercial side, because everybody pays attention to that in the boardroom. And so if it makes commercial sense, they'll say, well, hey, that's a no-brainer, and it reduces our carbon even better. So that's the thing, and and it's also why we sort of target, I suppose, premium products as well, or premium brands, because if you're selling a bottle of whiskey for 100 quid, if it costs an extra 20 or 30 pence in being zero carbon, no one really notices. And that's sort of the balance we have to get. We need to bring that all the way through to bread and butter. And so actually it sits in there as well.
Last question, to what extent do you see blockchain technology playing a role in reducing audit and verification costs for carbon credits?
Yeah, well, first of all, we are fully blockchain based. We built it with intent. One of the interesting things, if you look at the nature of a carbon credit, it's an intangible asset. It's digital by nature. The verification process and the recording of all the data, again, digital by nature, and also the carbon credit itself, when it's born, when it's issued, has its own LEI, its own legal identifier. So the ability to track, trace, the whole conversation around double spend and double counting goes away when you use the underlying asset, the blockchain, distributed ledger architecture, asset-backed tokenization, which is what we've employed. And we've integrated it with all the, so again, carbon, especially the voluntary space, is evolving, and companies like B0 and Silvera and Calyx, the rating systems have come up. Legacy companies like TÜV Süd and TÜV Nord, which I see you mentioned, TÜV Süd, in your presentation, working with them, working with the traditional markets, the Veras and the gold standards, as they're moving into a digital world and API connectivity. That integration works really well in the blockchain and ledger architectures. So it's going to be very important going forward, for sure. And the immutability of it, right? It doesn't just sit. I know early on when we began this, we were talking to companies, big multinational corporations, going, where does your ESG information sit? You know, it's on the CSO officer's, you know, his laptop, right? In an isolated, with no interconnectivity, no verifiability, and that's it's just, you can't do that anymore. It's got to be in a public forum, right? And again, immutability is really key. So and traceability and verifiability. So the blockchain presents that great opportunity going forward in use cases.
And the last question, Tom, which token do you use?
We're on Ethereum. We use ETH. Polygon is our blockchain backbone, and we've used a lot of different systems, and we keep evolving, and we're agnostic on that. We can run private chain, public chain, but ETH is our backbone, and I see that really as that is the utility token going forward. So, yeah.
Thank you, Tom. I'm just going to pass this whole session now back to Roddy to close the session for us.
Arbe, thanks. Yeah, and it's my pleasure to be able to thank the three of you, Arbe, Bill, Tom, for having made people who perhaps didn't know very much before, very much more knowledgeable now. And this has all been recorded, and so for others, they'll be able to see it on YouTube soon. So very grateful to our panel. I just wanted to point out that on the 16th of April, we have another webinar linked into Singapore on climate collaboration, accelerating net zero solutions in Asia and the EU. The Asia Scotland Institute itself has got a visit on the 11th of April from the ambassador of Mongolia to the United Kingdom, and we'll be asking him what the opportunities are for people to deal with Mongolia. And we didn't get a Mongolian question today. But against the background of our mission, which is to increase people's understanding of Asia, particularly tomorrow's leaders in Scotland, for whom the century of Asia is going to dominate their lives. A big thank you again on behalf of the Asia Scotland Institute. Thank you to 1RHT for the whole event. And again, to all of you, have a great day, and good evening again to you in Singapore, and in Edinburgh, we've got the rest of the day in front of us. So more to do. So thank you all very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.